Hello, and welcome back to the Potted Plant Politics YouTube channel. And in today's video, I'm going to once again subject myself to the horror of watching Question Time. This is the latest episode, airing on the 26th of the 6th, 2026. All the sixes? 66. Who says I can't be a professional bingo caller? A man can dream, I suppose. Tonight's panel includes the Labour chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Emma Thornbury, Kevin Honrake, the Conservative Party chairman, and, rather entertainingly for this episode, Zia Youssef, Reform UK's Home Affairs spokesperson. Brilliant. Can't wait for that one. He's my favourite ever politician, says no one. Because he's not even a elected MP. And Stephanie Flanders. She's head of economics and government at financial data and news company Bloomberg. And finally, of course, it is being presented by presenter Fiona Bruce. So, the first question I would like to start on is, the question was basically, is Andy Burnham the right man to fix the country and bring hope back to the nation? And one gentleman in the audience raised his hand, and he actually made a very good point that the Labour's 24,000 majority, as he says, I don't know if those were the exact numbers, but they had a large majority regardless, isn't representative of the country now. Two years ago, they were suggesting that we shouldn't have an unelected prime minister. Now, obviously, Andy Burnham is coming in as an elected, same as Richie Sunak did. Boris Johnson, even though he called a general election, and Gordon Brown, as I said in my last video. So, this is obviously a topic of some tension, and in my personal opinion, do I believe there is good cause for a general election? Probably yes, there is plenty of reasonable cause for it, because as the gentleman said, Labour should really practice what they preach, and if Andy Burnham really backs himself, he should call a general election and get a fresh new mandate in with new objectives, so he can raise national insurance and income tax and do the things that his Labour government want to do rather than following the old mandate. But now here's the question: should Andy Burnham call for a general election in the current climate? I think for the sake of the Labour Party, he definitely shouldn't, because, well, either Labour will lose a significant amount of their seats to parties like Reform, and maybe even possibly the Green Party, even though I haven't heard much from them in the news as of recent, ever since Zach Polanski got criticised for criticising the police force in the handling of that incident. But will they potentially lose the election? That would be the main concern. But definitely a more plausible concern is they will lose seats and lose their majority, and Reform will gain even more power, even if they don't win. So should he? Practically, I don't think he should. Morally, maybe there's more of a case for it, as we do live in a democracy, and people should be able to exercise their right to vote. But it's scary that if we do go to a general election, Reform do have a very good chance of winning. So a lot of people in this audience seem to be stuck on the question of, we don't know what Andy Burnham represents, and is he just gonna come in and do the exact same thing as Keir Starmer did? And that's a very fair question. And generally, Emily Thornberry tries to answer this question by saying somehow that Andy Burnham is more ingrained in traditional Labour values than Keir Starmer was. I would I would maybe agree with that in terms of his personal values, but is he as skilled as politics as Keir Starmer was? Because we gotta remember that he hasn't been an MP for 10 years, at least. And 10 years is a long time to not be an MP. He was mayor of Greater Manchester during that time, which is still good experience. But he wasn't an MP, so is he gonna be as skilled and as adaptable as Keir Starmer was just because of his personal beliefs and values? I don't think so. Um, Simply because we we as a country and as individuals haven't seen enough of Andy Burnham yet. So I wouldn't write him completely off, but I'd also slightly disagree with Emily saying that he's naturally going to be better than Keir Starmer is just because of his personal beliefs. In my opinion, personal beliefs, they don't actually impact politics as much. Personal beliefs can sometimes hinder politics and political decisions. I mean, look at Tony Blair being pushed into Iraq because of his personal beliefs in that we should defend the sovereignty of Western values and things like that. So, yeah, sometimes having a bit of personality and personal beliefs and personal values in politics is a good thing, and it can be like that's where Andy Burnham has got his whole thing for devolution from. That's his personal belief that the North should also get more control in politics, which I agree with. But at the same time, the main thing you need in politics, in my opinion, is diplomacy and patience rather than anything else. Does he have those? We don't know because we haven't seen him yet, but we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Oh, Kevin, Kevin, Kevin. You just stumbled into a can of worms you do not want to open, my friend, because he just said that the only person being realistic about defense spending is, drum roll please, Kemi Badenoch. Yeah? Yeah, sure. Kemi Badenoch is the leader of a party that was responsible for cuts after cuts after cuts. Cuts to prison funding. Even direct cuts to defence spending. Austerity. Not to mention, she's the person who literally said we should join the war in Iran on the side of the Americans. She's the person who said, I believe it's called the HMS Dragon, forgive me if I don't know the name of the ship, needs to be deployed in Iraq and the Middle East, and we need to give America access to our air bases in the Middle East. She is the person who said that we should be catching the arrows before they're fired. And this is the person you want in charge of defence, yeah? The same person who now runs the party, who is responsible for 14 years of austerity and cuts constantly, all the time. Don't be a fucking idiot, Kevin. So, apologies in advance, ladies and gentlemen, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk about the absolute piss stain, which is Zia Yusuf. And I'm going to have to talk about him saying that we don't know Andy Burnham's vision and he makes U-turns all the time. And yes, I have to agree with him somewhat, as I have agreed with many of the audience members that we don't know Andy Burnham's vision, but criticizing him for changing his mind all the time, I don't think that's right. Because in my personal opinion, a politician has to change their mind on certain policies. For example, the the Labour government's U-turn on winter fuel payments and the U-turn on cutting the welfare bill only come after protests from the general public letting them know that they need to change, and as Zia Yusuf says, make a U-turn on those policies because nobody likes them and nobody wants them. So, what is Zia Yusuf suggesting? That a Labour government should ignore the general public and go with what they think is right? Sounds to me a slight bit wrong and possibly very troubling. And reminds me of when Reform stated that they would like to centralise the police force under political rule. Do you remember that? How scary would that be? If so, basically, by admitting that they don't like to make U-turns, what they're suggesting, and now I will admit this is a bit of a reach, that if the general public don't like something, Reform will just do it anyway, as long as it gets through the Parliament. And yes, this is a bit of a reach, like I said, but it's basically the moral undertone of what they're suggesting in decisions like leaving the ECHR and the Human Rights Convention. So, Mr. Zia Youssef, I wouldn't exactly say that having the ability to change your mind and make U-turns is a weakness as long as the general public don't disagree or agree with it, and as long as you're serving the general public's best interests, it doesn't really matter what policies you use. Now, you can criticise the Labour government, for example, choosing to cut winter fuel payments and the welfare bill and budget, rather than breaking their manifesto and upping things like income tax and national insurance tax to raise more money that way. That is an example of a fair and, in my opinion, quite valid criticism. And now, in comes the Conservatives on the welfare system. What do they say? That by cutting low level uh, low level conditions and men, mental illnesses, the UK could save 23 billion for defence spending and other things, etc. Now, that is the stupidest point I have ever heard someone ever speak. Not because of the figures, the statistics. I don't have those on me. I also don't have the proper research at the moment to suggest whether those figures are right and wrong. But what I do have is common sense. And my common sense tells me that you can't possibly quantify the meaning of low level mental illness and conditions without pissing thousands of people off. He gives an example of ADHD. And yes, maybe some people with less severe versions of ADHD would be able to work and contribute to the economy. But then most people with less severe versions of ADHD probably are already working, mate. Because I know someone who's autistic and has a little bit of ADHD diagnosed from his doctor, and he is working right now as a school assistant in a classroom. He also used to work as one of my carers. But I've also seen people with the more severe side of ADHD. These are the sort of people that don't seem to understand social cues and panic a lot and get anxious in big social situations with social groups. Now, they might struggle to work. So, who are you, Mr. Hall, Hall Rankin, to say that those people shouldn't be claiming benefits? Because, you know, people people find things difficult and people often like to work at their own pace. And you can't blame people for not wanting to work because it's often not their choice, because sometimes they find it difficult and sometimes they're better off maybe not working or learning personal skills before working, and that might take some time for them to learn the necessary skills and get less anxious in those big environments. But I think the biggest point I'm trying to make is, how would you really know certain people's levels, and how would you empirically quantify low levels compared to high levels? Because everybody is different in how they feel. And I know there are more severe and less severe, but say, for example, somebody like me who does get anxious from time to time, suffers with depression, downturns, I am still able to work and go out there and present myself in the right manner. But other people might not be, and we've just got to be patient with those. We've got to sort of rehabilitate them and help them to assert themselves first before we push them into work. And you know what the funny thing is? I don't disagree with the thing, with the thinking, but saying that it's easy and we could easily save 23 billion if we just get the people back into work. It's going to take time, mate. And these people have rights to protest. So, as Labour discovered, even if you do try and cut the welfare bill, there will be severe backlash. So, yeah, apologies for that little rant there, ladies and gentlemen. But all I was basically saying is, actually, I don't disagree with the goal. I just disagree with the execution, and simply just stating that we can save this much if we do this, and putting it in very simple language is almost invalidating the people who suffer with these so-called low-level conditions and mental illnesses. So, pardon me, one of the gentlemen in the audience did actually say that it's quite rich of the Yusuf to keep arguing on about the constant change of prime ministers and things like that, because he he and his party leader were the architect of the cause of the problem, not him himself, but Nigel Farage particularly was the cause of the problem, because he says the reason why we're quote unquote ungovernable was Brexit. But also the gentleman in the audience kind of stumbles and struggles to articulate his point properly, so I'll try my best. Brexit is certainly one of the biggest reasons and biggest political decisions that has made it more difficult for this country. Simply because of the reason that we've now lost our biggest and most easiest trading partner to trade with. This has led us to make deals with America to bring in goods like vegetables and meats that are 10, 10 times more expensive. Not literally, but more expensive than they were before. And it's also led to greater taxes on exports for farmers exporting their beef. And this was meant to be the whole thing with Brexit. It was meant to make British produce the forefront, and we were all meant to live on British produce. And actually, we've actually ended up importing it from places like New Zealand and Australia, particularly when it comes to meats such as lamb, are just effectively whatever taxes they want, because there was no other big trading partners available. So, yes, Brexit did have a huge did have a huge cost when it comes to the cost of living crisis and potentially the difficulties in international diplomacy, which then, because things like the cost of living increase and the increased reliance on imports from countries where we were paying high taxes, that was a major contribution factor to the the seven prime ministers in 10 years, I believe it was. And the factor of Brexit cannot simply be pushed under the rug as if it never existed. I'm coming towards the end of this now, and one of the final questions is: should the Conservatives and Reform collaborate to challenge Labour? And you know what good old Kevin said? He said that I don't think we need to collaborate with any other party because Kemi Badenoch is clearly the one to become the next Prime Minister. She's the only one who takes it seriously. And I've just got to laugh there, Laugh there because she doesn't. She is more focused on the sort of social media outrage, TikTok shorts, lines that will get views. We see this in Prime Minister's questions all the time when she's like, oh, one, we need to join the United States in Iran. And just a couple weeks ago, she spent all her questions in Prime Minister's questions challenging Keir Starmer on what he knew about the influence of Jeffrey Epstein on Peter Mandelson, and did he know of their relationship? Which is all well and good and is a valid question. If Keir Starmer didn't repeat several times that he was fully cooperating with the investigation and he wasn't aware of the full extent of the relationship. Now, whether you believe that or not, which I'm personally not going to get into because it's quite a touchy subject, but to waste 6 questions. Is it 6? I believe it is 6 questions the opposition gets in every Prime Minister's questions, and to waste all of them on the Prime Minister giving you the exact same response every time, but you not taking the answer because you want to essentially clip farm so it looks good for your social media is simply ridiculous. And you have also said we need to drill in the North Sea. I'd argue that perhaps we don't. We need to actually further invest into green energy solutions. You can't just ignore climate change because climate change definitely exists, Kemi Badenoch. So, poor Kevin over here has been sent like a lamb to the slaughterhouse onto question time in order to look like an idiot. I'd argue that in some questions on this specific question time, he has looked more stupid than Zia Yusuf has. He did, however, nail Zia Yusuf on the question of, well, if you think it's so easy to run for Parliament, and if you think it's so easy not to make U turns on certain policies, one, why has Nigel Farage made U turns on, for example, getting the Royal Navy to tow the immigration small boats back to the northern of France. And why have you, if you're so adamant that it's so easy to be an MP and an elected politician, never run yourself? And that's a good point. Zia Youssef counter argument to that was he has tried to run before, but they've got a professional process. But personally, him being as high up in reform as he is, he's pretty high. He's one of the main faces. There's absolutely no way that if he wanted to put his name forward, Nigel Farage or Richard Tice would say, "No, Zia, you're not doing this. Instead, we're gonna go with some random bloke who is a plumber and has said some rather crude comments about Rachel Riley and Carol Vorderman in the past." So, that is it for this episode of Question Time. I hope you enjoyed. I would just like to clear up a few things. There seems to be an undercurrent of not being, does being popular as a prime minister really matter? And I made a point about Tony Blair and Iraq and how he was essentially pushed into it by the United States, Bush, and him being his self belief in being a defender of free will and Western values, which the United Kingdom should always be. But at the same time, Iraq was a very unpopular decision at the time, with many protests taking place, and still to this day, many people say that is the one stain Tony Blair has on his otherwise quite popular tenure as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, does being popular matter? And does making U-turns on policy matter? I would say possibly being popular always matters, and making the right decisions by your country always matters. So if you're willing to U-turn on unpopular policies, that is always a good thing from my point of view, because it means you're listening to what the general public wants, and you're not just acting as your own individual set of beliefs and your own values. You're acting as a Prime Minister of Great Britain for the people of the UK. And can Andy Burnham do that? We'll just have to wait and see whether he can. But in my personal opinion, he does need to be careful not to rely on his own instinct and values. Don't get me wrong, it's always good to have those, but to also act on the needs of every single citizen of the United Kingdom as a whole country and not just his own belief systems. That is at least my biggest takeaway from this particular episode. Let me know what you think about politicians making decisions based on their own instinct, external political pressures, or should they listen more to the citizens of the United Kingdom in the same way Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and the Labour Party eventually did with their welfare system and winter fuel payment U-turns? Because I don't think making U-turns when it comes to policies is a bad thing. And the interesting thing is, I have to give that credit then to not just Labour, but also, sadly, I have to be objective and give a bit of credit to Reform and Nigel Farage for making those U-turns, even though I don't think those U-turns were his decision. Because if he had his way, there's little change in his mind if he was to get in as Prime Minister. Okay, bye all.